Ectolife is basically an artificial womb system which allows for customized genetic human offspring. A lot of people have very adverse reactions to this sort of technology because it seems unnatural. I personally think that society should focus on helping the 100+ million orphans worldwide before investing in this sort of artificial womb technology and before breeding more humans in general. Voluntarily having children is in itself a very selfish and inconsiderate act. There's a lot more I can get into about why that is, but first I need to point out two logical fallacies that many tend to commit: the status quo fallacy and the naturalistic fallacy. They are very similar. The status quo fallacy is basically when someone tries to justify something by saying that it's okay because that's just the way that currently is, while the naturalistic fallacy is when someone tries to justify something as being good all because it's natural. They are fallacies because slavery was once the status quo and the way that things were. Certainly did not mean that slavery was actually okay, nor did it mean that it was necessary for society to function. Same goes for earthquakes, starvation, deadly diseases, meteors. They are natural, right? But that still doesn't mean that you would be okay with being harmed by earthquakes, starvation, deadly diseases, and meteors, right? Just because starving to death is natural, doesn't mean that starving to death is good. Be sure to keep these fallacies in mind as I explain why reproduction in itself is immoral, especially in the current state of conditions. Reproduction involves forcing a non-consenting infant to be completely submerged in an adult's genital fluids for almost an entire year, and then shoving this non-consenting infant through an adult's vagina. Practically every surface area of the infant's body is directly touching an adult's vagina. In addition, childbirth is an extremely dangerous and painful process for infants, since their heads are getting squeezed so hard that many of them permanently lose IQ points. Then after being born, the doctors, if the birth is done at a hospital, are then required to shove tubes down the baby's trachea without anesthesia in order to pump adult vaginal fluids out of their lungs, or else the baby runs a very high risk of getting pneumonia. The baby never agreed to any of this. The baby is a non-consenting infant being forced into this dangerous, painful, and violating ordeal against their will. In addition to that, the baby is also being forced to play Russian roulette with a wide variety of misfortunes that could befall them at any point in time through no fault of their own, such as genetic defects, medical problems, car accidents, unstable economy, etc. In some areas, this non-consenting person is then being forced to play reverse Russian roulette. What's reverse Russian roulette, you might ask? As the name implies, it's basically the inverse of Russian roulette, where instead of there being only one loaded chamber in the gun, all of the chambers are loaded except for one. In other words, reverse Russian roulette is where the most likely outcome is something bad, but the least likely outcome is for things to turn out alright. There is so much danger and pain and suffering in this world that is completely unavoidable. Dealing with people in general is a great example of reverse Russian roulette, because most people who seem great at first will just end up being complete two-faced backstabbing douchebags later on. All things considered, it's certainly morally wrong to do all of this to a non-consenting infant. There is actually a word to describe the philosophical outlook that reproduction is morally wrong, and it's called antinatalism. A lot of people would try to counter these sorts of antinatalist arguments by stating that they as individuals are happy with being born, so what's the big deal with reproduction if they were fine with it? But how is that any different than someone who likes skydiving to force other people to go skydiving against their will? How is that any different than someone who likes UFC fighting to force other people into the octagon against their will? It's not any different than those sorts of things. It's the exact same type of thing. It's forcing non-consenting people into risky, dangerous situations against their will, and then justifying it by saying that I as an individual enjoy taking these risks, so therefore other non-consenting people should be grateful that I forced them to do it as well against their will. On a side note, the octagon of life is far worse than the octagon of UFC for a few reasons. For one, UFC fighting is consensual, whereas being brought into the octagon of life is not. All participants in this world were brought here non-consensually to begin with. In addition, UFC fighters are allowed to stop the fight at any point in time, but in most, if not all, parts of the world, all non-consenting participants in the octagon of life are not legally allowed to get out when they want to. One common rebuttal to antinatalism is, well, if you don't like living here, why don't you just kill yourself? They say this, But they don't seem to take into consideration the fact that you are not legally allowed to commit suicide, in most if not all parts of the world. To add insult to injury, most of these same exact pro-natalists who want to tell antinatalists to kill themselves if they hate life so much will just so happen to be against the legalization of voluntary euthanasia. What sense does that make? It makes absolutely no sense, but that sort of crazy-making lose-lose nonsense is what's to be expected from your typical pro-natalist lunatic who wants to shove naked babies through adults' genitals. Yet another example of trying to rebut the moral critiques of reproduction is by simply committing logical fallacies. Oh, it's fine to reproduce because it's natural. Oh, infants touching an adult's vagina during childbirth is just the way it is, so there's nothing wrong with it are just a couple of examples of how a lot of people would commit the naturalistic and the status quo fallacies to justify their antics, as I've described earlier. So how can you possibly justify reproducing, i.e. forcing other non-consenting human beings into the octagon of life, at all, especially when there are currently over 100 million orphans worldwide? If you really want to have children, and you feel like your calling in life is to raise children, well then you can actually do something great with that desire by helping out some of the orphans that are already here who desperately need a good home. You might be surprised by just how few adoptions per couple it would take to adopt all the orphans. There are well over 100 million planned pregnancies each year worldwide, so that would mean that if all of those 100+ million couples who want to have children were to adopt just one orphan each, that would be enough to adopt all of the 100+ million orphans in approximately 1 year. That would clear up the backlog of orphans in 1 year, if all couples who want to have children were to adopt just one orphan each. Then what about the new orphans that are produced during the subsequent years? Well, if there are approximately 2 million orphans produced each year, then that would mean that only 2 million of the 100+ million couples who want to have children would each need to adopt only one child each year for all of the orphans to be consistently adopted over the long term. Then what? With all of the orphans adopted, would the human race go extinct, since anybody with a moral conscience would obviously choose to not rape non-consenting babies into this hellball known as planet Earth? Well, not necessarily. What would happen then is that the inconsiderate, malevolent section of the human population, which I like to refer to as hell monkeys, will still breed like rabbits regardless of the consequences, but that's offensive to rabbits. They don't care about the consequences and the harms to others that are a direct consequence of their selfish, cruel, and immoral decision to rape non-consenting infants onto a hell ball, also known as planet Earth. With that in mind, reproduction of the human species is pretty much guaranteed to occur regardless, even if all good people were to choose to exclusively adopt and never breed. So, as you might have already thought, what if those good people were to adopt all the orphans and then breed once all of the orphans are taken care of? Would that not mean that good people could reproduce as a harm reduction means in order to outcompete the douchebag hell monkeys who are pretty much guaranteed to breed no matter what? Think about it, what is the worst scenario? Good people abstain from reproduction altogether while hell monkeys breed uncontrollably, or good people adopt all of the orphans and then breed in order to outcompete the hell monkeys? The first scenario would result in far more pain and suffering for everybody involved, right? The offspring of hell monkeys are more likely to turn out worse, and eventually we would be back to square one with abandoned orphans in foster care, right? Well, with the second alternative of good people adopting all of the orphans, and then breeding to outcompete the hell monkeys, that would mean a way better outcome and way less suffering for all of those involved, right? So while antinatalism's claim of it's morally wrong to reproduce because it inflicts danger and harm onto non-consenting sentient beings is true, you could still make a reasonable harm reduction scenario that would justify reproduction under certain circumstances, like I've described before. It completely grants the premise that reproduction is wrong, but it's just saying that under some circumstances, reproduction would lead to a less bad situation overall. One analogy is the idea that it's morally wrong to stab people. However, if there is someone who is unconscious and needs medical care in order to survive, and that requires stabbing them with a needle to provide life-saving IV treatment, then you would be justified in stabbing someone in that particular situation as a harm reduction measure. So when it comes to Ectolife, I would obviously not be in favor of using it right now when there are 100+ million orphans worldwide, as I am opposed to any reproduction in the current circumstances. However, once all the orphans are adopted, And you are left with a choice of decent people not reproducing while inconsiderate hell monkeys reproduce nonstop versus decent people reproduce as a harm reduction measure to outcompete the inconsiderate hell monkeys breeding without any care for others, then obviously the second choice is going to lead to far less pain and suffering than the first choice, as explained earlier. So if we are going to go with the second option, then which form of reproduction would be less harmful? The natural way, aka uterine incubation, which involves painfully raping a baby, or the ectolife way, which certainly has the potential to be far less damaging to the well-being of both the infant and the biological mother, right? In addition, ectolife provides a way to select the genes of the offspring, which would ensure that they don't suffer from any horrible genetic birth defects. Plus, the baby's health is going to be more closely monitored 24/7 with ectolife than what would otherwise be possible with uterine incubation. All in all, I think that reproduction is wrong in general, but if you were to do it, I think that you could only reasonably justify it if there are no orphans left to adopt, and even then it should be done with artificial incubation instead of uterine incubation, simply because the artificial method is far less dangerous, risky, and painful than uterine incubation.